Jack's voice echoed through the quiet yard as he pointed directly at Sarah, who stood behind the wheelchair where Emily remained seated. The 11-year-old boy had run along the stone path until he reached them, his clothes dirty from the ground and sweat-soaked hair sticking to his forehead. His hands trembled as he repeated the words he had rehearsed throughout the journey to get there. The afternoon sun beat down on his sweaty back, and he could feel his heart pounding, ready to explode in his chest. David immediately let go of the wheelchair's handles and turned his whole body to face the boy. The expression on his face changed from surprise to something much more serious. His eyebrows furrowed, and he took 2 steps toward the boy, closing the distance between them. "Repeat what you just said. She puts things in Emily's food, things that make her unable to move her legs." Jack quickly glanced at Sarah and then returned his gaze to David. Fear was etched on the boy's face, but there was also a determination he had never felt before. "I saw when she thought no one was watching. She takes a small bottle and mixes it into the juice." Emily, who had been silent until then, slowly turned her head to look first at Jack and then at Sarah. Her eyes carried an expression David had never seen before, a mix of fear and hope that left him cold inside. The 12-year-old girl had a thinner face than a few months ago, and her skin was paler than it should be for someone who spent so much time outdoors. Sarah stepped aside, distancing herself from the wheelchair. Her voice came out controlled, but there was something forced in it, as if she were measuring each word. Before speaking, "David, this boy is making up stories. You know how children are. They confuse things, mixing reality with imagination." "I'm not making it up," Jack shouted, and tears began to stream down his dirty face. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, leaving a mark of dirt on his cheek. "My mother has worked in your home for 2 years, cleaning and cooking. I see everything that happens when you think no one is paying attention. I know when something is wrong." David felt his heart race. There was something in the urgency of the boy, in the way he trembled, and the desperate expression on his face that didn't seem like the behavior of someone who was lying. He crouched down to Jack's level, placing his hands on the boy's shoulders. He could feel how tense the boy was, as if every muscle in his body was ready to run at any moment. "Tell me everything you saw from the beginning." Calmly. Jack wiped his tears with the back of his hands and took a deep breath before starting. His words came out in a rush at first, but then gained a more controlled rhythm. "Emily got sick 4 months ago, didn't she? She stopped being able to walk overnight, but before that, I saw her trying to get out of the chair when Sarah wasn't around. She could stand, holding onto the living room wall." "That's not true," Sarah interrupted, her voice louder than usual. There was a rigidity in her body that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. "Emily has a serious neurological condition. The doctors have explained this several times. It's impossible for her to stand." "Let the boy speak." David kept his eyes on Jack, but his voice carried an authority that made Sarah take a step back. "Continue, Jack. I always played with Emily when you weren't home, especially on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when you had those long meetings." Jack looked at Emily, who was listening to every word with complete attention. She could stand, supported by the living room wall for a few minutes. She could take a few steps, holding onto the kitchen table. Her legs trembled, but she could do it. Sarah laughed, but it was a forced laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "David, you're going to believe the fantasies of a child. I take care of Emily every day. I'm the one who gives her baths, helps her get dressed, and does physical therapy at home. I know better than anyone what her condition is. And you're the one who makes her food too." Jack didn't take his eyes off Sarah, even as she tried to intimidate him with her glare. "Always alone, you never let anyone help, not even my mother, who always helped with everything in the house before Emily got sick." David remained silent for a few seconds, processing what he was hearing. Emily had indeed fallen ill very suddenly. In 1 week, she went from an active child running around the yard and climbing trees to a girl who couldn't move from the waist down. The doctors Sarah claimed to have consulted hadn't been able to explain what had happened properly. At least that's what she told him. They spoke of an impossible spinal cord injury, but David had never seen any tests, no medical documents. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees around them, creating dancing shadows on the ground. The playground was almost empty at that hour of the afternoon. Only a few joggers passed. By the main trail from time to time, David could hear the distant sound of children playing on the playground, their cheerful voices contrasting with the tension that had settled between them. "Emily!" David turned to his daughter, his voice softening. "Can you feel your legs now?" The girl looked at Sarah before David responded, as if asking for permission or checking if it was safe to speak. This gesture did not go unnoticed by Jack. "Sometimes I feel like my legs are tingling, like when we stay in the same position for too long, and sometimes it hurts a little." She is confused because of the medication. Sarah moved closer to the chair again, placing her hand on Emily's shoulder in a way that seemed more possessive than affectionate. Her condition affects sensory perception. The neurologists have explained this several times. "Which neurologists?" Jack suddenly asked, his voice gaining more confidence. "Because I've never seen any doctor come to your home, and my mother has never seen one either. She is there from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening every day of the week." David felt something cold rise up his spine. For the past 4 months, Sarah had always said she was taking Emily for regular medical appointments, but he had never gone along because she insisted it was better to keep the routine stable, and that the presence of too many people made Emily anxious. They always returned from those appointments with Sarah, saying that the doctor had recommended more rest and that the home treatment was going well. "Sarah, what time do you leave for those appointments?" David asked, keeping his tone neutral, but observing her every reaction. "It varies," Sarah replied too quickly. "It depends on the doctor's availability, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, but they never leave the house." Jack spoke more firmly now. "My mother is always there. She cleans the entire house every day. She would know if you left. And the wheelchair always stays in the same spot in the living room." Sarah looked visibly uncomfortable, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This boy is lying, David. I don't know what interest he has in making up these stories, but I will not tolerate these accusations." "I'm not lying!" Jack shouted again, his voice echoing through the playground. "And there's more. I heard Sarah talking on the phone once. She told someone that it was working, that Emily was getting weaker, and that soon she would be able to ask for what she wanted." The silence that followed was deafening. David could only hear the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. Sarah had gone completely still, as if she had turned into a statue. Emily looked from one to the other with wide eyes. "When was that conversation?" David asked, his voice coming out lower than he intended. "About 3 weeks ago. It was a Thursday morning. I had arrived early because my mother had forgotten the house key in her work bag." Jack was now speaking, looking directly at David, completely ignoring Sarah. "She was on the back porch, away from the room where Emily stays. She was speaking quietly, but I managed to hear some things. David, let's go home." Sarah placed her hand on his arm, her fingers squeezing harder than necessary. "This boy is disturbing Emily. Look how anxious she is." Emily did not seem anxious. In fact, she looked more alert than David had seen her in months. Her eyes sparkled in a way he had forgotten existed, as if a light that had gone out was starting to turn back on. "Emily, do you remember the last time you went to the doctor?" David asked directly to his daughter, gently removing Sarah's hand from his arm. Emily thought for a few seconds. I don't remember going to the doctor after I got sick, Dad. I only remember that day you took me to the hospital when I fainted. Sarah quickly interrupted. She doesn't remember because of the pain medication. It's normal in cases like hers. What medication? David asked. Because I've never seen you give her medicine. I mix it in her food so it doesn't traumatize her, Sarah replied, but there was an almost imperceptible tremor in her voice. It's the protocol recommended by the doctors. Jack moved closer to David. That's exactly what I'm saying. She mixes things in the food, but it's not pain medication, it's something else. How do you know it's not pain medication? David asked. Because when my grandmother got sick and had to take pain medication, she became happier, more relaxed. Emily gets sadder and more tired after she eats. Jack looked at Emily with genuine affection in his eyes, and she always gets sleepy after lunch and dinner at the same time every day. David began to make connections he didn't want to make. Emily had indeed developed a very regular sleep pattern in recent months. She always napped after the main meals, even when she said she wasn't tired, and she had lost weight, despite Sarah insisting she was eating well. Jack, where did you see Sarah waiting for the bottle you mentioned? David asked, completely ignoring the furious look Sarah was throwing at him from the kitchen cabinet on the top shelf, behind the spice cans. It's a small, unlabeled bottle with a clear liquid that has no smell. Jack spoke quickly, as if he were afraid of forgetting some important detail. And she always puts it in the orange juice, never in solid food, always in the juice she makes fresh every day. Sarah removed her hand from David's arm and took a step back. I'm not going to stay here listening to these ridiculous accusations from a child who clearly has psychological issues. Emily needs to go home now. No. The voice came from Emily for the first time in the entire conversation, with firmness, surprising everyone. I don't want to go home yet, Dad. I want to stay here a little longer. David looked at his daughter with a mix of surprise and relief. There was something in her voice that he hadn't heard in a long time. A firmness, a will of her own that seemed to have disappeared along with her ability to walk. Emily was expressing herself, making decisions, something she hadn't done in months. Why don't you want to go home, sweetheart? David crouched down beside the chair, placing his hand on her arm. Emily glanced quickly at Sarah and then turned her eyes back to her father. Because when I'm at home I get really tired, and here I feel more awake. Emily, are you sure that sometimes you can feel your legs? David asked quietly, just for her to hear. Yes, Dad. And sometimes I try to move my toes under the blanket when she's not looking. They move a little. Emily looked directly into her father's eyes, and David could see an alert intelligence that seemed to have been dormant. But when I'm close, they feel heavy again, like they belong to someone else. Sarah took a step back, her face visibly paler. That's impossible, Emily. You know you can't just make things up like that. You'll confuse your father. She's not making it up. Jack stepped closer to the chair with more confidence. Emily, show your dad how you can move your foot, like you did last week when Sarah went out to buy bread. Emily looked at Sarah, then at David, and finally at Jack. There was fear in her eyes, but also a growing determination. Slowly, she pulled the blanket off her legs. Her legs were thinner than David remembered, but they didn't look like they were completely atrophied. Everyone fell silent, watching. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Emily closed her eyes, concentrating intensely. Then, almost imperceptibly, her right toe moved. Then the left, and she managed to slightly bend the toes of both feet. Sarah looked visibly shaken. Her hands trembled as she spoke. That's just involuntary muscle spasms. The doctors already explained that can happen in cases of partial spinal injury. Which doctors, Sarah? David stood up slowly, not taking his eyes off her. His voice had taken on an authoritative tone that she had never heard before. Because I want the full names, the phone numbers, the addresses of the clinics, and I want to see all the tests, all the prescriptions, all the documents. Now, David, you're being paranoid and ridiculous. Sarah tried to regain her composure, but her hands continued to shake. Of course, I have all that information organized at home. It's all stored in my office. Then we're going home now, and you're going to show me everything. David held the handles of the chair before Sarah could touch them. Jack, your mother is working today. She is. She'll be there until 6 p.m. doing the weekly cleaning. David looked at the clock. It was 4:30 p.m. Then we're all going home now. Jack, you're coming with us. He looked directly into Sarah's eyes, his expression leaving no room for discussion. And Sarah, you're going to explain to me exactly what's in that jar behind the spice cans. Sarah stood still for a few seconds, as if calculating her next words with extreme care. The wind had completely stopped, and the silence in the playground became almost oppressive. David could see small beads of sweat forming on her forehead, even though the afternoon wasn't particularly hot. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly until then, were now completely rigid at her sides. She looked alternately at David and Jack, as if measuring the degree of threat each represented. There's nothing to explain because there's no jar. Sarah spoke slowly, enunciating each word. With forced precision, this boy is clearly disturbed for some reason and is making up stories to get attention. Jack stepped forward, placing himself between David and Sarah. His tears had dried, and now there was a fierce determination in his eyes that contrasted with his fragile appearance. His dirty clothes and unkempt hair made him look even younger, but his posture was that of someone who had decided to fight for something important. I can show you exactly where it is. On the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, behind the can of oregano and the can of paprika. It's a small glass jar with a black lid. David, for God's sake! Sarah placed her hand on her chest in a dramatic expression that seemed straight out of a play. Are you going to believe this child instead of me? After everything I've done for Emily, after all the months I dedicated to taking care of her while you worked 10-12 hours a day. Emily, who had been quietly watching the discussion, shifted slightly in her chair. She tried to lean forward, resting her hands on the sides of the chair. The movement was subtle, but David noticed. There was something different in his daughter's posture, a vitality that seemed to be awakening little by little. Emily, what are you doing? I'm trying to lean by myself, Dad. Her voice came out clearer than it had in months, with a strength that David had forgotten she possessed. I could do this before. I want to see if I can still do it. Sarah immediately moved toward the chair, her reactions faster than they should have been for someone who was only concerned about safety. Emily, don't do that. You could hurt yourself. Her voice had taken on a tone of urgency that hadn't been there before, an anxiety that seemed disproportionate to the simple movement Emily was making. You know you need to sit up straight in the chair. The doctors were very clear about that. Why can't she try? David asked, blocking the way of Sarah when she tried to get closer to the chair. If she wants to try to move, what's the problem with that? Isn't that what physical therapy is supposed to encourage because she could fall and hurt herself more? Sarah tried to go around David, but he moved to continue blocking her path. There was something almost desperate in her movements. Now, David, you don't understand the seriousness of her condition. Any sudden movement could cause permanent damage. Jack approached the chair from the other side, coming within reach of Emily's hand. Emily, you can lift your arms by yourself, without anyone helping. Emily looked at Jack, and then at Sarah, who was visibly agitated. There was a hesitation in the girl's eyes, as if she were asking for permission or checking if it was safe to try. Slowly, she lifted both arms above her head. The movement was a bit shaky at first, but it gained steadiness. She managed to keep her arms in the air for several seconds before lowering them. And when she did, There was a smile of surprise and satisfaction on her face. "See, Dad, I can do some things." Emily smiled for the first time in months, a genuine smile that lit up her pale face and made David realize how much he had missed that expression. "But at home I get really tired to do anything. It's like my body gets heavy." David felt a tightness in his chest that almost made it hard to breathe for a few seconds. How had he not noticed that his daughter wasn't smiling anymore? How had he let this drastic change in her behavior go unnoticed? He prided himself on being a present father, but it was clear he had failed to recognize important signs. "Emily, when do you feel more tired, specifically during what times of the day?" "After I eat," she replied without hesitation, as if it was something she had observed many times but never talked about, especially after lunch and dinner. "I always get so sleepy, even when I don't want to sleep." Sarah quickly interrupted, her voice coming out louder than she intended. "That's completely normal. The body uses a lot of energy to digest food. People with neurological conditions get tired more easily. Any doctor can confirm that. My grandmother also had neurological issues." Jack spoke, looking directly at Sarah, his voice gaining more confidence with each word. "She had advanced Parkinson's, but she never got sleepy after eating. She became more restless, especially at the end of the day." David began to walk in small circles, processing all the information that was being revealed. Every detail that Jack and Emily mentioned made more sense than the vague and repetitive explanations Sarah always gave. There was a cruel logic forming in his mind, a possibility he didn't want to accept, but that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. "Sarah, explain something that has always bothered me. Why did you never let me go to the medical appointments, not once in 4 months? I've explained this several times." Sarah crossed her arms defensively over her chest, but David could see that her hands were trembling slightly. "Emily is calmer when there are fewer people around. It's a specific medical recommendation for cases like hers. Changes in routine can cause regressions in treatment." "What cases exactly?" David stopped walking and faced her directly, using the tone of voice he employed in important work negotiations. "Because until today, you never gave me a specific diagnosis. You always talk about neurological condition or spinal injury, but never anything precise, never a technical name." Sarah hesitated for a few seconds, her gaze diverting from David's for the first time in the conversation. "The diagnosis is complex, involving several factors that the doctors are still investigating. It's not something that can be defined in a single appointment." 4 months, David raised his voice slightly, feeling the frustration grow. 4 months of investigation, and they still don't know what she has. That's not normal, Sarah. Jack approached David again, his small but determined presence. "Mr. David, can I share one more thing? I saw something important." David nodded for him to continue, realizing that Emily was also paying full attention to the conversation. "I saw Sarah looking on the computer at things about medicine, but they weren't medical or hospital websites." Jack looked at Sarah, who had become visibly tense, her hands clenching into fists. "They were sites that teach about poisonous plants and dangerous chemicals, and I saw her taking notes in a small notebook." David felt the blood run cold in his veins. "What kind of sites exactly?" "Sites that talk about natural poisons, about plants that make people weak or sleepy." Jack spoke quickly, as if afraid of forgetting important details. "And I saw her researching how to make people unable to move their legs." Sarah laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, forced and inappropriate for the situation. "That's ridiculous. I'm researching Emily's condition to understand better how to help her. It's the responsibility of the caregiver." "Researching poisons is the responsibility of the caregiver?" David asked, his voice laden with growing disbelief. I wasn't researching poisons, Sarah spoke quickly, stumbling slightly over her words. I was researching medicinal plants. Sometimes the information gets mixed up on those sites. Jack shook his head vigorously. They weren't medicinal plants. They were plants that hurt people and had numbers written down, quantities. What kind of numbers? David asked, feeling he was getting closer to something much more serious than he had imagined. They looked like measurements, like when my mom writes down food recipes, but with different words, milligrams, doses, and time intervals. Jack looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed fear and determination, and they had times marked like a schedule. Sarah laughed again, but this time it was a nervous laugh that felt entirely out of place. The sound came out strangled. I write down everything related to Emily's care because I need to be organized. Medication schedules, food quantities, sleep hours. It's basic organization for any responsible caregiver. So show me that notebook. David spoke directly, leaving no room for retreat. I want to see all those notes. It's now at home in my office, along with all the other medical documents. Sarah quickly replied, but David could tell she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. David looked at Emily, who was following the conversation with an attention she hadn't shown in months. Her eyes were bright and alert, very different from the vague and tired expression that had become normal. Sweetheart, do you remember how you felt before you got sick? What was a normal day like for you? I felt full of energy, Dad. I would wake up early and want to play, want to run in the yard. Emily paused as if she was struggling to access memories that felt distant. I would climb the big tree in the backyard, play with the ball. I helped you in the yard on weekends, and I ate everything. Now I only want to eat the things she prepares especially for me. What things specifically? David asked, realizing he was uncovering details about his daughter's routine that had completely gone unnoticed. The orange juice she makes every morning and afternoon, and that special soup she says has important vitamins. Emily looked at Sarah with an expression David couldn't fully interpret. She always says, those are the only things that will make me get better faster. Jack fidgeted visibly with his hands, moving as he spoke. That's exactly what I'm trying to explain. She only lets Emily eat and drink those specific things, and always prepares everything herself. She never even lets my mother help. David felt a wave of anger and guilt rising in his chest simultaneously. For months, he had completely trusted Sarah, believing she was taking care of his daughter in the best way possible. He never questioned her methods, never asked to see medical documents, never insisted on attending appointments. He had been content to work long hours, knowing Emily was being cared for, but now he was realizing that his absence might have allowed something terrible to happen. Sarah, this ends now. David firmly grasped the handles of the wheelchair. We're going home, and you're going to show me all the medical documents, all the prescriptions, that notebook, and anything else related to Emily's treatment. David, you're making a mountain out of a molehill over a child's fantasies who clearly has issues. Sarah tried once more to grab the wheelchair handles, but David wouldn't allow it. Emily needs to maintain her routine. All this commotion isn't good for her nervous system. I'm not agitated, Dad. Emily spoke clearly, her voice sounding stronger and more present than David had heard in a long time. In fact, I feel more awake than I have in weeks. It's like a fog is lifting from my head. David began to push the wheelchair toward the exit of the playground, his pace determined and quick. Jack, you're coming with us. I want you to show me exactly where you saw that bottle and anything else you remember. Jack ran to keep up with David's pace. His breathing quickened, but his expression showed relief at finally being taken seriously. Yes, sir, and there are other things too. Sometimes I hear her talking to herself in the room she uses as an office. She repeats numbers and dates as if she's following a plan. Sarah walked alongside them, but David could tell she was becoming increasingly tense with each step. Her hands were clenched into fists, and she was constantly biting her lower lip. Occasionally, she looked back as if considering the possibility of fleeing. "What kind of numbers exactly?" David asked while continuing to push the wheelchair, maintaining a pace that allowed no hesitation, like a countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7. And then she says things like next phase or increase concentration. Jack glanced at Sarah quickly before continuing, and once I heard her talking on the phone about money, a lot of money. David abruptly stopped walking, the sound of the wheelchair wheels scraping against the pavement. "Money? What kind of conversation about money?" Sarah interrupted before Jack could respond, her voice coming out louder and more desperate than before. "This boy is making up conversations he never heard. He wants attention and is using Emily's situation to get it. It's obvious. Why would I want attention by talking about those terrible things?" Jack asked, genuine confusion in his voice, his eyes filling with tears again. "I like Emily. She's my best friend. Why would I want to make up bad things that could hurt her even more?" David resumed walking, but now his pace was even faster. A growing urgency had taken over him, a desperate need to get home and uncover the whole truth. "Emily, when was the last time you drank normal water, tap water, or regular mineral water?" Emily thought for a few seconds, her expression showing the effort to remember. "I can't remember, Dad. It's been a long time. She always says I can only drink the special juice and the teas she prepares. She says normal water can interfere with the medicine and harm people with my type of problem." Jack looked at David with wide eyes of disbelief. "That can't be right. Clean water doesn't harm anyone who's sick. In fact, it's the... When my grandmother was in the hospital, the doctors told her to drink a lot of water." Sarah quickened her pace to get in front of them, turning to walk backward as she spoke. "Enough of this chase. I will not tolerate these completely ridiculous and unfounded accusations any longer. David, if you can't trust me after everything I sacrificed for you, after all the months I dedicated exclusively to caring for Emily, then maybe it's best if I pack my bags and leave today." David stopped again and looked directly at her. There was something in the way she spoke, a subtle but clear threat that he did not like at all. It was as if she was trying to force him to choose between investigating his suspicions or losing her completely. "No one is asking you to leave, Sarah. I'm just asking for honest and transparent explanations. If there's nothing to hide, why are you so upset and defensive?" "Because I am being unjustly accused of hurting a child I love, as if she were my own daughter." Sarah placed her hand on her chest again, but David noticed that the gesture seemed more rehearsed and theatrical each time. "That hurts deeply, David. It hurts more than you can imagine." Emily shifted in her chair again, trying to turn to look better at Sarah. "Sarah, can I ask something I've always wanted to know?" Sarah looked at her with an expression that David couldn't fully decipher, a mix of forced affection and something that seemed almost possessive. "Of course, my dear, you can ask anything because you never let me be alone with Dad. Whenever he comes home from work, you show up in the living room a few minutes later, and when we're talking, you always interrupt to say it's time for medicine or rest." The question caught Sarah completely off guard. David could see that she did not expect that observation from Emily. She opened and closed her mouth several times, clearly searching for a response that sounded convincing. "Because I want to make absolutely sure that she is always receiving the best possible care. It's my responsibility." "But Dad is my dad." Emily spoke with a simplicity that made her words even more powerful. "He took care of me my whole life. Before I got sick, he knows how to take care of me." David felt a lump in his throat that almost prevented him from speaking. His daughter was absolutely right. In recent months, Sarah never let him be alone with Emily for more than a few minutes. She always appeared with some plausible excuse, whether to check if she needed anything, to give some medicine, or to say it was time for scheduled rest. He had interpreted this as extreme dedication, but now he was seeing it as control. "Emily is right," David spoke, slowly, each word heavy with meaning. "Why do you never let us have private father-daughter moments?" Sarah was silent for a few seconds that felt like an eternity, clearly searching for an answer that wouldn't incriminate her, because Emily's condition required constant medical supervision. Someone with specific knowledge needs to be always alert to any changes or complications. "But I am her father. I can certainly take care of her for a few hours without supervision," David insisted, realizing he was touching on something important. "You don't understand the technical complexity of her case." Sarah spoke more quickly now, the words tumbling out. "There are specific protocols that need to be followed rigorously, subtle signs that need to be monitored. Timing, I need it for medications." Alex, who had been quiet for a few minutes, listening attentively to the conversation, suddenly perked up as if he had remembered something crucial. "Mr. David, there's something very important I forgot to mention. Once I saw Sarah waiting for another vial in the kitchen freezer, a vial different from the one in the cupboard." Sarah turned completely pale, the color draining from her face so quickly that David thought she might faint. "That's a blatant lie." "In the freezer?" David asked, completely ignoring Sarah's desperate denial. "Yes, at the very back behind all the ice cream boxes and bags of frozen vegetables." Alex looked at Sarah with a challenging expression that contrasted with his age. "She put it in a black plastic bag and hid it in the corner. It's a smaller vial still, with a very fine white powder inside." David resumed his path with the determination bordering on obsession. Now it was no longer just curiosity or normal paternal concern. It was an urgent and desperate need to get home and uncover the whole truth, no matter how terrible it might be. "Sarah, when we get home, I sincerely hope you have very convincing explanations for absolutely everything we are discovering." The journey home felt longer than ever for David. Each step echoed on the pavement with an urgency that made his heart race. The afternoon sun had taken on an orange hue, casting long and distorted shadows on the sidewalk, as if even natural light was conspiring against him. Sarah walked beside him in silence, but he could feel tension radiating from her body like visible waves of heat. Her hands trembled visibly, and she constantly looked around, as if searching for an escape route or hoping someone would appear to help her. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then closed it again, lost in thoughts that David couldn't decipher. Alex kept pace beside the wheelchair, occasionally touching Emily's arm in gestures of silent support. The boy seemed to have matured years in a matter of minutes, his childish expression replaced by a steely determination that impressed David. Meanwhile, Emily seemed more alert with each passing minute, as if the dense fog that had covered her mind for months was finally beginning to dissipate. She moved her head constantly, observing everything around her with a curiosity that had been absent for so long. When they arrived at the gate of the home, David noticed that his hands were cold and clammy. The property, which had always been a refuge of peace and tranquility for him, now seemed to carry a sinister and threatening atmosphere. The windows of the house looked like eyes watching his movements with malevolent interest, and every shadow cast by the leafy trees in the yard took on shapes that his troubled mind interpreted as potential threats. Sarah must be in the laundry room at the back. Alex spoke as they stopped in front of the dark wooden front door. "It's Thursday, so she's washing the bed linens and towels. She always does this on the same day of the week." David turned quickly to him, his eyes shining with an intensity that hadn't been there before. "How do you know the routine of the house so well? Why do you pay so much attention to schedules and activities?" "Because I've been coming here with my mother since I was very little," Alex replied without flinching, lifting his chin defiantly. I grew up playing in this house. I know every corner, every cupboard, every hiding place better than you, who arrived here just over a year ago." David unlocked the heavy door and pushed Emily's wheelchair into the spacious entryway. The interior of the house was enveloped in a silence that felt different from the usual, denser and laden with expectation. He could hear the distant rhythmic sound of the washing machine running, echoing through the hallways, confirming that Sarah was indeed working in the back of the property. The house smelled of lemon-scented cleaning products and something sweet that he couldn't immediately identify, a fragrance that felt strangely artificial. "Let's go to the kitchen first," David announced authoritatively, steering the wheelchair down the corridor that led there. "I want to see that jar Alex mentioned. I want to see it with my own eyes." Sarah positioned herself strategically between them and the kitchen entrance, her arms extended as if she could physically prevent them from proceeding. "David, this is completely ridiculous and unnecessary. You're turning our home into a battlefield over the fanciful inventions of a child. They are really fanciful inventions, so there's no harm in checking." David maneuvered around Sarah with determination in his voice, gaining a tone of firmness that she had never heard before. "Alex, show me exactly where you saw the jar. Don't be afraid." The kitchen was impeccably organized, as it always had been since Sarah worked for them. All the utensils gleamed in their places, designated to marble surfaces, reflecting the light that streamed through the large windows, creating an atmosphere that felt straight out of a decor magazine. Alex went directly to the tall lightwood cupboard and pointed precisely to the top shelf. "Up there, Mr. David, right behind the spice cans, hidden in the right corner." David had to drag a sturdy chair to reach the indicated shelf. His hands trembled slightly as he began to carefully move the cans of oregano and other spices. For a moment of anguish, he found nothing and began to think that Alex might have been mistaken or that his childhood memory had distorted the facts. Then his fingers touched something cold and smooth, hidden deep in the shelf. Behind a larger can of saffron, it was exactly as Alex had described, an impressively accurate small clear glass jar with a black plastic lid, containing a completely clear liquid that looked like water but without the characteristic smell. There was no label, no identification of what the contents could be, no indication of origin or composition. The jar was deliberately hidden, positioned so that only someone who knew exactly where to look could find it. "What is this, Sarah?" David slowly got down from the chair, holding the jar with extreme care, his eyes fixed on her face, which had lost all color. Sarah looked visibly shaken, but desperately tried to maintain some composure. It must be some concentrated cleaning product that Sarah stored in the wrong place by distraction. You know how she sometimes gets confused with organization, a cleaning product hidden behind the spices we use for cooking. David gently shook the jar, watching how the liquid moved. "And why doesn't it have a label? Every cleaning product has mandatory identification." Emily leaned forward in her chair with effort, propping herself on her arms to see better what her father was holding. "Daddy, that liquid looks very familiar to me. It looks like that clear stuff she sometimes puts in my orange juice when she thinks I'm not paying attention. Emily, my dear, are you confusing situations?" Sarah spoke quickly, but her voice came out tense and slightly high-pitched. "I never put anything in your juice other than natural vitamins dissolved and supplements recommended by the doctors." Alex approached David with determined steps. "Can I show you the other jar now, sir? What's hidden in the freezer is even stranger than this one." David nodded gravely, carefully putting the first jar in the inner pocket of his jacket. They headed to the large stainless steel freezer located in the darkest corner of the kitchen. Alex pointed precisely to the back of the frozen compartment. "You have to take out the ice cream boxes and the bags of vegetables first, sir. It's well hidden back there." David began systematically removing items from the freezer, his hands growing intensely numb. Boxes of ice cream in various flavors, plastic bags of frozen vegetables, airtight containers of prepared food, leftover containers. At the absolute back, in the compartment exactly where Alex had indicated with surgical precision, was a double black plastic bag, carefully tied and sealed. Inside it, protected from the cold and humidity, was another, even smaller bottle. This one contained a very fine white powder that looked like flour but had a different, more crystalline texture. And this here, Sarah. David held the second bottle, feeling the icy weight against his fingers, his patience draining quickly like sand in an hourglass, more cleaning product stored in completely the wrong place. Sarah looked around the kitchen desperately, as if searching for a magical exit or an explanation that could emerge from the walls. Her hands trembled so intensely that she had to brace them firmly on the marble countertop to avoid falling. "I can absolutely explain all of this. There's a perfectly logical explanation. Then explain it now." David carefully placed the two suspicious bottles on the countertop, aligning them side by side. "I'm waiting. They are concentrated natural supplements." Sarah spoke rapidly, the words coming out at an increasing speed. "Home remedies that I extensively researched online and on specialized sites to specifically help in Emily's neurological recovery. They are alternative treatments that traditional medicine does not recognize." Emily stirred in her chair with more energy than she had shown in months, trying to see the bottles more clearly. "Sarah, if these are remedies to help me, why have you never shown me? Why do you always hide when you put something in my juice? Why do you do everything secretly? Because they are very bitter and unpleasant-tasting remedies, my dear." Sarah quickly replied, but her voice betrayed a growing nervousness. "If you knew they were being added, you wouldn't want to drink the juice. It's a matter of therapeutic strategy." Alex shook his head vigorously, his disheveled hair moving with the force of the gesture. "That's not true at all. I saw you researching poisons online about toxic plants that paralyze people. They weren't natural medicine sites." "Paralyzed," David corrected automatically, but all his focus was intensely on Sarah. "Is what Alex is saying true? Sarah, were you really researching toxic substances?" "Of course not," Sarah shouted, completely losing the carefully constructed composure she had maintained for months. "I was researching alternative and complementary treatments. Sometimes, information about medicinal plants gets mixed with other information on the same sites." At that moment, the sound of firm footsteps approached the kitchen entrance. Karen, Alex's mother, appeared in the doorway, methodically drying her hands on a well-worn floral apron. She was a middle-aged woman with graying hair neatly tied up in a bun and intelligent, observant eyes that immediately sensed the electric tension dominating the atmosphere. Her expression instantly shifted from surprise to concern when she saw the suspicious bottles on the countertop and Sarah's completely altered expression. "Good afternoon, Mr. David." Karen spoke respectfully, but her experienced eyes quickly moved between the mysterious bottles on the countertop and Sarah's visibly desperate expression. "Something serious has happened here, Karen. Have you seen these bottles before?" At some point, David had shown the containers to her, carefully observing her reaction. "Be honest with me, please." Karen approached and examined the bottles with meticulous attention, carefully picking them up and observing the contents against the light. "I've never seen these bottles in my life, Mr. David, and I clean this kitchen every day of the week without exception. I know every item that exists here. If these bottles had been stored in this kitchen, I would certainly have seen them during cleaning." Sarah quickly interrupted, her voice coming out louder than she intended. "Don't you clean all the high shelves, Karen? There are specific places you can't reach because of your height." "I do clean, Mrs. Sarah. Karen replied firmly, her dignity offended. I always use the proper ladder to reach all the shelves, including the highest ones. I've always done that during all these years working here. It's part of my job. David looked at Karen with a serious expression that she recognized immediately. Karen, I need you to be completely honest with me about something very important. Have you seen Sarah putting any special substance in Emily's food or drink? Anything that seemed out of the ordinary? Karen hesitated for a few long seconds, nervously looking between David and Sarah, clearly torn between professional loyalty and genuine concern. Mr. David, I don't know if I should get involved in these personal matters. Karen, please. David used a gentler yet firmer tone, placing his hand on her shoulder. It's about my daughter's health and safety. I need to know the whole truth, no matter how hard it may be to hear. Karen took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and looked directly into David's eyes. Yes, sir. Several times on different occasions, I saw Mrs. Sarah putting drops of some liquid substance into Emily's orange juice, and whenever I appeared in the kitchen at those moments, she quickly hid what she was doing and sent me out of the kitchen to do other tasks. Sarah looked visibly desperate, her hands flailing in the air. Karen, you're blatantly lying. Why would you make such a serious accusation against me? What have I done to deserve this? I'm not lying, Mrs. Sarah, and unfortunately there's more. Karen looked at David with genuine concern etched in her tired eyes. Sometimes I heard you talking on the phone about money, a lot of money, large sums. You said everything would be resolved soon and that you could finally ask for everything you wanted. David felt as if the solid ground was literally disappearing beneath his feet, leaving him floating in a terrifying void. What specific kind of conversation about money, Karen? Very detailed. She was talking about inheritance, Mr. David, about how it would be relatively easy to gain full legal custody of Emily, if you were not more present. Karen stopped, clearly struggling with what she was going to say next, and about how you would not live much longer if you continued to take those special teas she prepared every night. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Sarah was leaning against the counter, her face completely white as a sheet, her lips trembling, and her desperate eyes darting from one person to another. Emily looked from one adult to the other, trying to process and understand the magnitude of what she was hearing. Alex held his mother's hand with a protective grip, his wide eyes filled with shock. Sarah! David spoke slowly, each word laden with overwhelming emotional weight. Do you want to explain to me exactly what Karen just said? Do you want to explain to me these conversations about my death? Sarah looked desperately around, the kitchen like a cornered wild animal searching for any possible escape route. This is a terrible misunderstanding. Karen completely misunderstood what she heard. She distorted everything. I didn't misunderstand anything, Karen insisted with wounded dignity. I heard clearly, sir. You were talking about how financially comfortable it would be when you had full custody of the girl, and about how Mr. David would not live much longer if he continued to drink those sleeping teas that you prepared religiously for him every night. David felt a cold shiver run down his spine from his neck to the base of his back. What teas exactly does Karen describe? The relaxing teas that Mrs. Sarah always prepared especially for you before bed. She said they were to help with the accumulated stress from work to ensure a restorative sleep. David suddenly remembered with terrifying clarity. In the last 3 or 4 months, Sarah had indeed started a ritual of preparing special relaxing teas for him to drink before bed. He had never questioned this practice, interpreting it as loving care and attention to his well-being. But now, rethinking it with a completely new perspective, he realized he always slept abnormally deeply. After those teas, invariably waking up tired, confused, and struggling to concentrate in the early hours of the morning. Emily. David turned to his daughter with renewed determination. Can you try to stand up now? Can you make that effort for me?" Emily quickly glanced at Sarah and then back at her father, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and hope. "I can try, Dad. I want to try." Sarah moved with surprising speed toward the chair, her movements desperate and uncontrolled. "No, she absolutely cannot do this. It's extremely dangerous for her condition." David physically blocked Sarah's path, placing himself between her and Emily. "Why exactly would it be dangerous? Sarah, explain scientifically why it would be dangerous for my daughter to try to stand. Why? Because she could fall and seriously injure herself, she could worsen the existing injury, or because she might discover that she never really lost the ability to walk?" David asked, his voice heavy with a cold, controlled anger he had never felt in his life. "Is that what you're afraid will happen?" Emily, inspired by the growing courage she saw in her father and encouraged by the presence of Alex and Karen, determinedly placed her hands on the arms of the chair and began to rise with visible effort. Her legs trembled intensely from lack of regular use, but she managed to stand completely for several seconds before needing to lean on the marble counter to maintain her balance. "I did it, Dad." She smiled through the tears streaming down her thin face. "My legs are very weak from lack of exercise, but I can stand. I can support myself." Sarah slowly backed away until she was pressed against the back wall of the kitchen, her escape options dwindling rapidly like water draining down a drain. David approached her deliberately, the two suspicious bottles still in his hands, as irrefutable evidence. "Now you're going to tell me the whole truth, Sarah, from the very first day." David spoke with an absolute authority that allowed no refusal or negotiation. "What exactly do you have in those bottles, and why have you been systematically poisoning my daughter for months?" Sarah remained pressed against the wall for long seconds, her eyes desperately scanning each face present in the kitchen, as if searching for a single expression of sympathy or understanding. Her hands were pressed against the wall behind her, as if she could somehow merge with the structure and completely disappear from reality. The silence in the kitchen was so dense that the ticking of the old wall clock sounded like hammer blows echoing in an empty cathedral. The light coming through the windows had taken on a more intense golden hue, creating elongated shadows that subtly danced across the white walls. David held the two bottles in his hands as if they were sacred evidence, observing every micro-expression on Sarah's face with the intensity of an experienced investigator. He could perceive subtle changes in her body posture, in the way her eyes moved, in the tension of her facial muscles, and then he saw the exact moment when something fundamental changed in her eyes. When the carefully constructed mask of despair was slowly replaced by something much more dangerous and calculating, it was like watching a sinister metamorphosis happen in real time, right before his eyes. "Do you really want to know the whole truth, David?" Sarah finally spoke, her voice taking on a completely different tone than she had used until then. The genuine anguish and apparent desperation had been replaced by a cold, calculating control that made David feel a chill run down his spine, like icy fingers. "Are you absolutely sure you are emotionally prepared to hear exactly how everything was planned and executed?" Emily, still leaning against the counter, but now managing to maintain her balance. With growing confidence, Emily looked at Sarah with a complex expression that mixed childlike fear, natural curiosity, and a maturity forced by circumstances. "Sarah, why did you do those terrible things to me? I always liked you a lot. I trusted you as if you were family." Sarah laughed, but it was a sound completely devoid of genuine humor or any trace of human warmth. The laughter echoed through the kitchen like the sound of breaking glass. "Dear and naive Emily, You were always just a convenient means to a very specific end, an extremely useful tool to gain access to what I truly desired from the very first moment." "What end exactly?" David asked, his voice coming out more controlled than he actually felt inside, each word carefully measured. Sarah stepped away from the wall with fluid movements and began to walk slowly through the spacious kitchen, as if she were giving a masterclass or making a business presentation to investors. Her movements had regained a disturbing confidence that drastically contrasted with the desperation she had shown moments before. "Do you have any real idea of how much your total net worth is, David? Your multiple properties, your diversified businesses, your bank accounts in different banks? I meticulously researched every detail for months. It's tens of millions of dollars." Karen unconsciously pulled Alex closer to her, her well-developed maternal instincts immediately alerting her to the growing danger she could sense in Sarah's change of tone. She knew the signs of when a situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. "And you really thought you could just make me disappear and keep absolutely everything?" David asked, carefully maintaining his strategic position between Sarah and Emily, shielding his daughter with his body. "Disappear is a very direct word." Sarah stopped walking and faced him directly, with eyes that sparkled with cold, calculating intelligence. "I always preferred to think in more elegant terms, like accelerating natural processes that were already underway. People with high levels of chronic stress have heart problems every day in this country. Men in your age group, with the constant pressure of corporate work, are statistically frequent victims." David felt nausea rising in his throat like bitter bile. "And those relaxing teas you prepared for me every night, they contained carefully calculated doses of digitalis, purified, extracted from foxgloves that I discreetly cultivated in the farthest corner of your own yard." Sarah spoke with a sick pride in her technical expertise, as if describing a sophisticated culinary recipe. "In small but consistent amounts and administered regularly, the substance causes progressive fatigue, increasing mental confusion, and gradually, irreversibly weakens the heart muscle. A few more weeks of continuous treatment and you would have a completely natural and unquestionable heart attack." Emily let out an audible gasp of absolute horror, covering her mouth with trembling hands. "And what exactly were you doing to me all those months? What's in those horrible jars?" Sarah turned to her with an expression that could have been interpreted as genuinely maternal if it weren't for the completely cold and calculating eyes that accompanied it. "Veterinary muscle relaxants, my dear sweet Emily. Medications typically used on racehorses, but in meticulously calculated doses to cause progressive muscle weakness, without causing permanent neurological damage that could be detected in superficial medical exams." "But why were you doing this to me?" Emily asked between sobs, tears streaming abundantly down her thin, pale face. "Because orphaned children with apparent physical disabilities evoke much higher levels of emotional sympathy in family courts and judges responsible for custody decisions," Sarah explained, with a cold and chillingly irrational logic, as if discussing marketing strategies with your father who disappeared due to seemingly natural and unquestionable medical causes, and you needing constant specialized medical care would make it extremely easy and natural for your devoted and loving stepmother to obtain full and unquestionable legal custody. Alex broke free from his mother's protective embrace and took a brave step forward, his small fists clenched in indignation. "You are a very evil and cruel person. Emily has never done anything wrong to you. She has only been loving, a pathetic and naive child." Sarah looked at Alex with absolute disdain, as if he were an annoying insect. "In the real world of adults, smart people do exactly what is necessary to get what they want and deserve. I wanted absolute financial security, guaranteed economic stability, a comfortable life without worries. You were simply inconvenient obstacles to achieving Those perfectly legitimate goals. David felt anger rising in his chest, like a fire being constantly fed with fuel. How long exactly have you been devising and planning this strategy? Since when did you first meet us? Long before I specifically met you, Sarah smiled coldly, revealing perfectly aligned teeth that now seemed predatory. I have been researching and cataloguing widowed and financially successful men for several years as a profession. You were very carefully selected from an extensive list, David, a dedicated single father with an extremely demanding work schedule and in need of adult female companionship and domestic support. You practically begged me to enter your life and take on responsibilities. Karen found the courage to make her trembling voice heard. Mr. David, we need to call the police immediately. This situation is very dangerous. Sarah laughed again, the sound echoing through the kitchen like glass scraping against metal. And say exactly what to the authorities when they find some unlabeled jars stored in the kitchen? That a housekeeper with a high school education overheard fragments of phone conversations that she may have completely misinterpreted. We have the jars as concrete physical evidence. David lifted the containers, feeling their weight in his hands. Jars that could literally contain any harmless substance, nutritional supplements, natural medicines, dissolved vitamins. Sarah shrugged with calculated indifference at my polite and articulate words, against your interpretation, and I have a solid and established reputation in the community as a dedicated and competent caregiver. David noticed with growing frustration that she was partially right about the legal issue. The evidence was mainly circumstantial and interpretive. He desperately needed more concrete information. Sarah, there are other people directly involved in this criminal scheme. You mentioned researching wealthy men as a profession. That necessarily means there are other similar cases happening. For a crucial moment, Sarah visibly hesitated, and David caught something revealing in her facial expression that she tried to quickly hide. I have no idea what you're insinuating with that question. Alex clearly stated that you often talked on the phone about large sums of money. Who exactly were you having those regular conversations with? Sarah fell into total silence, but David could see that he had definitely touched on something extremely important and sensitive. Emily, who had been relatively quiet, absorbing all the absolutely horrifying revelations, suddenly remembered something significant. Sarah, do you remember those two elegant men who came to visit last month? You said they were specialist doctors, but they definitely didn't look or act like real doctors. Which men specifically? David asked immediately, feeling that he was getting closer to crucial information. She is not talking about anything relevant to this situation at all. Sarah spoke quickly, but David could perceive that her carefully controlled composure was beginning to show significant cracks again. They wore very expensive suits, and one of them had an extremely shiny and flashy gold watch. Emily continued with increasing determination, her memory becoming progressively clearer and more detailed, and they were watching me in a very strange and uncomfortable way, as if I were some kind of object or merchandise on display. David felt pieces of a much larger and more complex puzzle starting to fit together in his mind. Sarah, there are other people executing similar schemes elsewhere. This is part of a larger and more elaborate criminal organization. You are completely delusional and fantasizing. Sarah responded defensively, but her voice no longer had the same unwavering confidence from moments before. Alex suddenly perked up as he remembered something important. David, I saw Sarah burning a large pile of papers in the backyard last week. A huge amount of documents that she completely destroyed. What kind of documents were those? David pressed intensely. Sarah looked nervously at the kitchen's main door, clearly calculating her real chances of a successful escape. I have absolutely no legal obligation to answer any more invasive questions. You cannot physically force me to stay here against my will. In fact, we can keep you here. David determinedly blocked her direct path to the door. Karen picks up the phone immediately and calls the police. Right now, Sarah suddenly moved, with completely surprising and unexpected speed, trying to rush past David toward the exit. "Get out of my way immediately. You have no idea who you are getting involved with." David managed to hold her firmly by the arm before she could escape. "You are absolutely going nowhere until the police get here. Let me go immediately," Sarah shouted desperately, struggling with considerable strength against David's firm grip. "You don't understand the gravity of the situation. There are extremely powerful and dangerous people directly involved in this. If I don't fulfill my part of the deal exactly, all of you will be in real danger." "Which people exactly?" David tightened his grip on her arm even more. "Who else is involved in this criminal operation?" Sarah stopped physically fighting for a moment, looking around the kitchen with a genuinely panicked expression on her face. "You really have no idea what you have recklessly gotten yourselves into. This is much broader and more dangerous than an isolated case of domestic fraud." Emily, leaning against the counter but with her legs becoming visibly firmer and steadier with each passing minute, looked at Sarah with growing courage that even surprised herself. "You can absolutely tell everything to the police when they arrive. You can actively help stop these dangerous people. You naively think that it's that simple for the system to work." Sarah laughed with deep bitterness and absolute disbelief. "You really believe that people with this level of political power and financial influence simply stop their operations because someone brave reports them to the local authorities?" David realized with increasing clarity that there was much more to this story than he had initially imagined in his worst scenarios. "Sarah, if you cooperate fully with us, if you tell us absolutely everything you know about these people, maybe we can work together to protect you properly." Sarah looked with an expression of absolute disbelief and almost pity. "Protect you? You have no idea what you are naively offering as a solution." At that critical moment, the unmistakable sound of a powerful car arriving at the main entrance of the property echoed clearly down the hallway to the kitchen. Everyone present in the kitchen instantly tensed, listening intently to the growing sound. "This is impossible," the man with the watch murmured with genuine disbelief. "We meticulously cut all the phone lines on the property." Alex smiled for the first time since the dangerous men had arrived. "But you didn't cut my mother's cell phone. She sent an emergency text to my aunt before you entered the house." Karen nodded vigorously, tears of pure relief streaming abundantly down her tired face. "I told her to call the police immediately if she didn't hear from us in exactly 1 hour." The two men exchanged looks of genuine alarm for the first time since they had confidently entered the house. The threatening sound of sirens was getting progressively louder and closer with each passing second. "We have to get out immediately," the man with the scar said with real urgency. "Right now. And leave all these witnesses alive and talking?" the man with the watch asked hesitantly. "We have no choice. The police are arriving quickly," Sarah suddenly shouted desperately to David. "The car keys are on the entry table. Grab them and run out the back of the estate." The two men ran determinedly toward the kitchen door, but David managed to partially block their way with his body. "You're not getting away that easily." A brief but extremely intense struggle ensued. David managed to hold the man with the scar for a few precious seconds while Emily, showing absolutely extraordinary courage for her age, deliberately tripped the man with the watch, causing him to stagger. "Run, everyone!" David shouted to his family with all the strength of his lungs. "Get out of the home immediately." The sirens were now dangerously close, and the distinctive sound of multiple police cars stopping abruptly at the main entrance of the home echoed clearly through the shaken kitchen. The two men finally managed to break free from the struggle and ran desperately toward the back of the estate. "Police! Hands up! Nobody move!" The authoritative voice came from the main entrance of the home, echoing through the hallways. David hugged Emily tightly and ran with her toward the saving voice of the police officers, with Karen and Alex right behind them. Sarah remained in the devastated kitchen, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she looked in the direction where the two dangerous men had fled. "Everyone here!" David shouted with all his might. "In the kitchen! Please come quickly!" When the first uniformed police officers finally entered the kitchen, David had never felt so deeply relieved in his entire life. "Thank you, God," he murmured emotionally, holding Emily tightly against his chest. "Thank you for arriving in time to save us." 3 police officers entered the kitchen with their weapons drawn, their eyes quickly assessing the scene before them. Sergeant Johnson, a seasoned middle-aged man with greying hair, immediately lowered his weapon when he saw David hugging Emily and Karen protecting Alex. The tension in the air was palpable, but now there was a sense of safety that hadn't existed moments before. "Sir, are you injured?" the sergeant asked, cautiously approaching David. "We received an emergency call reporting an ongoing kidnapping." "We're not physically hurt," David replied, his voice still trembling from adrenaline. "But 2 armed individuals just fled from the back of the estate. They are extremely dangerous." "Corporal Smith, soldier. Costa, surround the estate immediately," the sergeant spoke into the radio. "Suspects on the run, consider them armed and dangerous." Sarah, who had been leaning against the wall during the police's entrance, suddenly began to cry uncontrollably. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I did." David looked at her with a complex mix of anger, pity, and relief. "Sarah, you need to tell the police everything. Every detail about this criminal organization. They will find me." Sarah shook her head desperately. "No matter where I hide, they always find those who betray them." Sergeant Johnson approached her carefully. "Ma'am, what exactly happened here? We need a full account." "She was poisoning me," Emily said clearly, surprising everyone in the kitchen. "For months, she was putting substances in my food to make me weak and make it seem like I had a serious illness." The sergeant looked at David for confirmation. "Is that true, sir?" "It is," David replied, picking up the 2 vials that were still on the counter. "We found these substances hidden in the kitchen, and there's much more to tell." Karen approached the sergeant, still holding Alex's hand. "Officer, this woman was part of a criminal organization. They killed other families before ours." The sergeant frowned, realizing he was dealing with something much bigger than he had imagined. "How many families?" "Hundreds," Sarah whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "The organization has been operating for decades. They have a network of operatives like me, women who infiltrate wealthy families." "And then? What happens next?" the sergeant pressed. "Then they eliminate the obstacles to the inheritance," David finished, feeling nauseous at verbalizing the reality. "They were also slowly poisoning me to make it look like a natural heart attack." Sergeant Johnson grabbed his radio again. "Central, we need a specialized task force and forensic lab here immediately. We have evidence of attempted murder and a possible criminal organization." Alex, who'd been quiet during the police's arrival, suddenly spoke up. "Officer, I have a notebook hidden in my room. I wrote down everything I saw Sarah doing for months." "You wrote it down?" David looked at Alex in surprise. "I knew something was wrong," Alex replied with impressive maturity. "So I started writing everything down, dates, times, what I saw her doing." "Smart boy," the sergeant smiled for the first time. "These notes are going to be very important for our investigation." Sarah straightened slightly. "I will cooperate with everything. I will tell every detail I know about the organization, but you need to protect me." Sergeant Johnson, one of the officers who had gone out to surround the estate, returned running. "We found an abandoned car 2 blocks away. The suspects fled on foot, but we already have a search team in the area. They won't be caught easily." Sarah shook her head. They are trained professionals. They probably already have escape routes planned. David hugged Emily tighter. It doesn't matter if they got away now. What matters is that you're alive and that this will stop here. It won't stop. Sarah looked at him sadly. The organization has other operatives active. Other families are going through the same thing you went through. Sergeant Johnson approached Sarah. So, will you help us identify these other operatives and save these families? I don't know of everyone, Sarah admitted. The organization is compartmentalized. Each operator only knows their own mission. But you must know at least some, David insisted. You can save other children like Emily. Sarah looked at Emily with tears in her eyes. Can you ever forgive me? Emily was silent for a few seconds, processing the question. I don't know, but I know you can help other children now. She will help, the sergeant interrupted. And we're starting right now. We need names, addresses, any information about this organization. In the next 2 hours, David's home transformed into an active crime scene. Forensic technicians collected suspicious vials, photographed evidence, and Sarah was extensively interrogated. She provided names of 5 other operators she knew, along with details about how the organization recruited and trained its agents. David was impressed by the courage Emily showed throughout the process. She answered the police's questions with clarity and precise details, recalling conversations and incidents he had completely forgotten. Dad, Emily said, when they finally had a few minutes alone, I can try to walk to the yard. David smiled with tears in his eyes. Of course you can, sweetheart. You can try anything you want. They walked together to the yard where Emily took her first truly free steps in months. Her legs were still weak, but with each step she gained more confidence. How do you feel? David asked, walking beside her as if waking from a very long nightmare. Emily stopped to touch a flower. It's like I'm really seeing the colors of the flowers for the first time. Karen and Alex approached them in the yard. Mr. David, the sergeant said, we're going to need to give more statements tomorrow. No problem, David replied. We'll do whatever it takes to dismantle this organization. And what about Sarah? Alex asked. What's going to happen to her? She will be arrested, but she'll likely receive a reduced sentence for cooperating with the investigation, David explained. And she'll be placed in police protection because the organization might try to silence her. Emily stopped walking and looked at her father. Dad, how many other families do you think we can save? I don't know, sweetheart, but I know that every family we save is worth all the effort. The sun was setting when the last police officers finally left the estate. David, Emily, Karen, and Alex sat in the yard, processing everything that had happened. It was hard to believe that just a few hours earlier they had been in mortal danger. Mr. David, Karen said softly, I need to say something. I always knew something was wrong, but I was afraid to speak up. Why? David asked. Because Sarah was very convincing, and because I needed the job. Karen lowered her head. I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. Karen, you saved our lives today, David said, placing a hand on her shoulder. If it weren't for your message to your sister, we would be dead. Alex approached Emily. You're going to be okay now. I'm going to be better than I was before I got sick, Emily smiled, because now I know I'm stronger than I ever imagined. David looked at his daughter with immense pride. In just a few hours, she had faced her poisoners, confronted dangerous criminals, and still held on to the hope of saving other families. She had become a brave and determined young woman. Dad, do you think we'll be able to have a normal life? After everything, Emily asked. I think we'll have a life better than normal, David replied, because we'll cherish every moment together. In the following weeks, Sarah's cooperation with the police led to the arrest of 17 people linked to the criminal organization, including 3 other operators who were actively poisoning their victims. 6 families were directly saved thanks to the information she provided. Emily fully recovered from the muscle weakness caused by the veterinary relaxants. She started physical therapy, and within 2 months, she was running again in the yard, stronger and healthier than ever. David also recovered from the effects of the digitalis, although he needed regular cardiology follow-ups. Alex became something of a hero at school when the story was reported by the newspapers. He used his temporary fame to create a young detectives club that taught other children to observe suspicious behavior in adults. Karen received an offer to work in witness protection, helping other families in similar situations. She accepted, feeling she had found her true calling. Sarah served 2 years in a semi-open prison regime, during which she continued to cooperate with investigations. When she was released, she entered the witness protection program and began working in social assistance, helping children who were victims of abuse. The criminal organization was never completely dismantled, but its operations were severely hampered by the arrests and public exposure. David created a foundation dedicated to identifying and protecting families in similar situations, using his own experience to train social workers and police officers. 6 years later, David sat in the same yard, watching Emily play with her younger brother, a boy he had adopted 2 years earlier, the son of one of the families saved thanks to Sarah's case. The afternoon sun painted everything with a golden light, and David could hear the children's laughter echoing across the estate. The home had become a true home again, filled with life, love, and hope. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a deep gratitude for every ordinary and peaceful day he could now live alongside his family. Some scars would never completely disappear, but they had become symbols of strength and survival, daily reminders that love would always be more powerful than any sinister conspiracy. If you've made it this far, leave a comment telling us what you thought. Your opinion is very important to us. Share this video with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any of our new content. Every like, comment, and share helps us continue creating amazing content for you.